active. But first, let's hear the perspectives of our speakers. So, Martha, the floor is yours.
Dr. Ian, thank you so much. And hi, everyone. It's really good to be with you today. Thanks for coming. Thanks for giving of your time on a really hectic first day. It's brilliant to be with you. My name's Martha, and I represent Anglican churches from around the world at the UN. The Anglican Communion is made up of lots and lots of different churches, including some who are represented here. We cover about 165 countries around the world. 85 or so million people are part of the Anglican Communion. And what's fascinating from the perspective of this topic is a role that gets you seeing how climate change impacts those countries differently, how a lack of sustainability in some places creates huge damage in others, and how even the word sustainability, it creates different impressions in different places around the world. So, for example, when I went to our church in Kenya, the Anglican Church of Kenya has set a 10-year strategy that has sustainability, that has climate justice as part of its 10-year goals, what it wants to stand for as a church, what it wants to advocate for nationally. And that has led them to change their theological education. It's led them to a huge restoration program, which has seen 4 million trees planted. And they're beginning to enable some work to shift to more sustainable energy away from fossil fuels. An amazing program. And I went there and I met with the Archbishop of Kenya, his chaplain, a guy called Dennis, who is running a program in Kenya called Green Anglicans. And this isn't somewhere where we paint Anglicans green. It's the real core of the kind of sustainable drive across the continent of Africa, particularly through young people. And he said to me when we were discussing sustainable lifestyles, but Martha, the majority of our congregations, they don't live unsustainably. And so how do we then talk to them about sustainability? It sounds like you're telling them not to hope for things, not to develop. So it's a really interesting question when we think about what does a sustainable lifestyle mean globally. And so I want to talk very quickly about 4 things, and then I'd love to hear from you as well in the interactive section. So when we think about sustainable lifestyles globally, I think the first thing that's really important from a Christian perspective, and from any perspective, but the vision that I'll talk to as Christian, is to have a vision of what good looks like. At the very end of the Bible, there's a picture of heaven, what Christians would call the new creation, or the recreated earth. And there you see dynamic relationships within a city where there is a clean river flowing through the middle, where there are trees abundantly, giving what the description says are leaves for the healing of nations. So there's nations coming together, lots of different tribes and tongues. There's healing, and there's dynamic relation with creation and human development, human flourishing. And it's that dynamism that I think is at the heart of sustainability. It's not just about me, it's about the wider perspective. It's about us. It's about our location in the world, and it's about our relationship with God. So the first, what's our vision? And what that looks like in practice, in the day-to-day now, because heaven might be a long way off, we never know, is to measure what we value. To measure what we value. Our churches in the Pacific are part of the Pacific Conference of Churches, and along with other faith groups, they have developed a way of defining development that goes beyond GDP, that goes beyond just financial growth. So they recognize that for them, climate change with rising sea levels is an existential threat. and they have a need to develop economically in their communities. But they said, we don't want to do that in a Western way. That's not our way. We want to do that in a Pacifica way. We want to do that in a way that accounts for our theology, our indigenous worldviews, our relationships with creation and with each other. So as they develop now, and this has been adopted by all of the governments in the Pacific as part of their 2050 strategy, they are accounting for the health of the environment around them, measuring water clarity, measuring soil health, things like that, replanting of trees, mangroves. They're also measuring community strength. How many vulnerable people do they have in the community? Do they know where they are? Can they respond to them proactively in disaster? As well as the financial growth. Excuse me. And they call this reweaving the ecological mat. It's this idea of a tapestry where the threads of economy, ecology, spirituality, and culture are woven together. If one goes, the whole thing collapses. There's an interdependence, just like we see in that picture of the vision of good, the vision of heaven. Okay, really quickly, my two final points. The next is the day-to-day practices that we see in our scripture, in what Jesus is teaching about how we live sustainably day by day. So one that I want to pull out is rest. When the earth was created, we read that God rested on the seventh day. 6 days he worked, seventh day he rested. If God thought it was a good idea and essential, it's probably also a good idea for us. If he rested, we can as well. And that brings a sustainability to the pattern of our week. The second thing, one of the most famous prayers in all of Christianity was Jesus' prayer that we call the Lord's Prayer. And in there he talks about, Lord, give us our daily bread. And there's a bishop that I work with that said, we pray for our daily bread, not for a deep freezer full of produce for the next 5 weeks. And there's some really important lessons there about living on God's provision, living sustainably, living day by day, recognizing that enough is enough. And that might be good for us, but it might also be good for our neighbors. And that brings me to my final point about which comes from the response that I got from Reverend Dennis in Kenya eventually to that question of, well, how do we speak about sustainable lifestyles? The response he gave me was that we talk about communities of creation. This isn't about me and my lifestyle alone. This is about us and how we come together as a community that celebrates and cares for creation. So for him in Kenya, that meant using his land to create a goat farm so that he could benefit from the sale of goat milk, but also people in the community could get that sustainably and cheaply. And so that he could then educate the local school children about sustainable farming practices. So there was an us. And that, for us as an Anglican communion, stretches all around the world. What does my impact mean on this family that I'm part of in 165 countries? If it's not an us with the person who is about to lose their home to rising sea levels in the Pacific, then we're not doing as good a job as church as we could do. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Indeed, you have raised a number of excellent issues. Well, I hope one day we will have heaven on earth if we do practice what our religions, all of the religions, have told us to do, and to preserve and conserve earth as God has created it. One of the things that you have mentioned is the day of rest. In many religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the seventh day actually is to revive nature and to give nature a chance. And if you remember during COVID-19, when we left Earth alone, it regenerated. I mean, bears and lions and everywhere. So we have to give Earth a chance to rest. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is a young person who I got to know a year ago, and we're proud to have Christian Noll chairing the Faith for Earth Youth Council. And since he took the chairmanship of the council, I can tell you, he's the next Secretary General of the UN. I love what you do. Indeed, I do. But Christian, aside from supporting us, he works with London School of Economics Earth Center.
Faith Center, yes.
Sorry, Faith Center. And he brings along with him the academic research background, but also the youth perspective. So we would love to hear from you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Dr. And that's indeed high praise, so a bit intimidated by that. But good afternoon, everybody. It's a true honor and delight to be sitting here next to these distinguished panelists and discussing how faith plays a role in encouraging sustainable lifestyles. And as Dr. had mentioned, my name is Christian Noll. I work as the project officer at the LSE Religion and Global Society Research Unit based within the Faith Center, which engages in academic research on the intersections between faith, religion, and global challenges, chief among them climate change. But I also serve as the chair of the UNEP Faith for Earth Youth Council, as mentioned. And today, in this 5-minute session, I want to share some insights from my work in both capacities on how we can bridge the gap between academia and action in this space. And I think if we look at the legislative foundation for this discussion, which I think we'll talk about later, I think we face three fundamental tasks. The first one is creating evidence-based conditions for informing and inspiring action. The second one is to encourage collaboration with the diversity of stakeholders, chief among them faith actors. And the third one is emphasizing the ecocentric value of sustainable living. And I see us accomplishing this task, these three tasks, through two primary avenues. The first one is equipping, and the second one is convening. On an individual level, we have to equip people with the skills and the knowledge to engage in discussions such as these. But in order to create a larger, more global impact, we also have to convene these people to share ideas and build networks. And I'm privileged to be able to do that in my capacity at the Youth Council. And academia and faith are pivotal in both of these areas, and I think respectively in many ways. So allow me to touch briefly on both of them. At LSE, where I work, we explore global issues like climate change through rigorous research. But our challenge is translating this research into action is often quite difficult, because research alone won't inspire change if it's disconnected from the values and the motivations that guide people's lives. And this is what we're finding where the difficulty often lies. And this is where faith can step in and play a role. So over the past 3 years, it concluded in July 2024, but our team led a research project entitled Global Religious Pluralities, where we focused on, again, how faith intersects with issues like climate change, conflicts, women's leadership, etc. And in fieldwork that was conducted across Egypt and Jordan, my colleague Dr. Hanan Benadi found that faith often shapes local perceptions of climate change deeply, even if it's often discussed in fora such as these in a more political or scientific, technological language. So my first point is that faith is already inspiring sustainable practices at the community level, often more powerfully than climate science. But this isn't necessarily apparent if we engage in the issue of climate change and on these matters from a language of politics and science. And that, I think speaks well to your point, Martha. What we've found is that fundamentally, sustainable living without faith is pointless. There's no need to take action to be sustainable if we don't have faith. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean faith in a God. It can be faith that our actions will actually inspire something, that our actions will change something. It can be faith that we are able to inspire others. Or it can, in the fact, as I'm sure is the case in this room, and for over 80% of the global population, it is in fact faith in a divine being that inspires this action in a very sincere and earnest way. So that's the first point. The second point is that bridging academia and action in this space requires engaging local voices in authentic ways, and faith partners and faith leaders can be partners in this. Just like academic institutions, faith communities have a unique power to it's also the communities that they're engaging in. One of the things we did as part of this research project was convene a workshop with young religious leaders and it was really incredible to see how the discussions about climate change brought together organizations which in other spaces and fora would never have sat together at the same table, and also how grounding the discussions about climate change in faith-based language actually allowed for a much more productive and coherent coming together to discuss the main challenges and practical solutions that they could then collectively take forward out of the workshop. So in a sentence summary, that would be faith-based discourses open doors for the sorts of discussions we need to be having, and that other discourses, such as the scientific and political discourses, often cannot. My third and final point is that how we bridge this gap is very important. And if we look at the resolution, which again we'll look at later, we can see that the language around education is framed as a thing which is to be given to others. But in discussing these resolutions and the steps forward, I want to challenge us to consider how we are informing, who we are informing, who is informing who is the expert in the conversation, and how much of this knowledge and education that we are seeking to impart is already embedded in the communities we are engaging with. And I found in my work at LSE and at the Youth Council, coming from the perspective of someone who is an educator is actually less effective than approaching it as someone who wants to be educated. And so I encourage us, as we engage in these discussions, to really consider how maybe the language that is best used to describe these challenges and figure out these solutions is already, in fact, in the room, and hopefully we'll be able to practice that in the next session. So to conclude, I just want to emphasize that faith is already shaping sustainable lifestyles. This is not a new thing. This is already happening. And it's up to us, the international and academic community, to recognize this and engage with this reality by including actors and faith leaders in deliberate and careful engagement through conversations such as this. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing further insights and engaging in these conversations at a later point. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christian. Indeed, research is a very important tool to understand what is happening and to know where we should focus our priorities. But I would like to challenge you. And the challenge is that you said faith already is shaping our sustainable lifestyle. That might be true in Jordan, Egypt, Indonesia, where in the southern part of the world where people are more connected to their religions. But I challenge you if this is the case in Europe and in the States. Because what we are seeing, the practices, the living, the way of living of not only the young people, but everybody, is contrary to what everybody believes. So probably a suggestion that we should focus our research on those communities and see where is our niche and how can we start that, drive in encouraging sustainable living according to religious but also ethical values. And this brings me to the ethics component. And we have Professor Dikri Sofyan, who comes from Globe Ethics, an organization that focuses on ethical component and part of doing things. I have been attending some of their conferences. The last one was in Geneva, and we talked about the role of ethics and values in shaping communities and how communities approach environmental sustainability. So, Professor Deki, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings to you all. I represent two organizations. So one is Globe Ethics, where I play the role as vice president. But the second one is I'm also affiliated to the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, which is a consortium that provides PhD training for people from around Indonesia and around the world on interreligious studies. So we've had, courses on religion and ecology and schools on pluralism and whatnot. But I also used to work for the Nature Conservancy, which is the US's largest conservation organization, both as communication director and also program director. But just recently, like maybe 4 years ago during the pandemic, I was also consulted. I was asked to consult for Greenpeace Middle East and North Africa. So basically, they gave me just one task, which is to mobilize 1.8 billion Muslims in the world to support climate action and sustainability. I said, where do I sign the contract after that? But basically, what my task there was to sort of try to find some of the sort of sacred texts and the teachings and the doctrines of Islam on climate issue and sustainable development. But for the past 3 years, I've been engaged in this program called the Eco Pesantren. Pesantrens are Islamic traditional boarding schools in Indonesia. There are around 49,000 of these schools across the country. So, these are Islamic traditional boarding schools which teach classical Islam, and where students are there living 24/7. And we sampled 50 pesantrens, and these pesantrens had a minimum student of 500. So we have small pesantrens, and we have big pesantrens like 50,000 theological seminarians. And one of the things we found was that, there is this gap between the attitudes of people and students on the environment and their behaviors and habits. I mean, if you look at the body of literature and work on this, you'll see that there is that, gap or discrepancy between the intentionality of people and wanting to care for the environment and the actual sort of action, behaviors, and habits. And this is where I think we can sort of mobilize our resources to try to fill in the gap. In my previous research in 5 countries on the sort of nexus between nature and culture, I found that there was the so-called the hardware of ecological sustainability, which is going beyond what is usually called the hardware of sustainability, which comprises the sort of scientific, technical data sets and analysis, and then you have the software, which is the sort of legal framework and the policy infrastructures, and then you have the hardware, which refers to the heart and the emotive factor and the sort of inner dimensions of the drivers of sustainability. So basically, based on our sample of pesantrens, we use 10 indicators. Among them relates to green space, curriculum development, on fiqh al-biyah, on the environmental evidence, and then on transportation, alternative energy, water resources, and whatnot. So one was found between behavioral change and the habits of people and students. The other is that, many of these religious communities, they're very low-key, they're very humble, so even as they are already some of these things to care for the environment, but sometimes they themselves don't realize that they're doing significant work for the planet. And so, this program sort of provided, fitting on them, and hence we provided awards which were given by the Ministry of Religious Affairs to some of the pesantrens which were already sort of doing quite well in their environmental care programs. The other thing we found out was that religious leaders are very central in the context of the pesantren culture, and therefore it really depends on the kiais and the ustads who are really taking the lead in these pesantrens in terms of environmental care. If they themselves have the knowledge and skills and competencies, and then you'll find that immediate sort of trickling down effect of the knowledge, skills, and attitude. And I think lastly, I'd just like to say that with the 49,000 pesantren in Indonesia, the government is investing quite a bit on this. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole directorate within the Ministry of Religious Affairs that deals with Islamic schools, religious schools, and also these Islamic traditional boarding schools. Now the government is trying to sort of materialize and realize the envisioning of what ISESCO did in 2019 on the sort of 4th of October declaration on the waqfs, on the endowments and how they can contribute to sustainable development. So we have programs like the Green Sukuk now in Indonesia and so on, where green projects are being sort of marketed as Islamic bonds, yeah, and whatnot for environmental care. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dickie. Before I say anything, we have a problem with the microphone. Sometimes it breaks out. So if you can provide another microphone. Dickie, thank you very much. It's been really enlightening, and I have always loved what is happening in Indonesia. This is a huge country with a huge potential, but also many innovative initiatives that have been taken, especially, going beyond the normal, Islamic teachings. You are adopting fatwas, the environmental jurisprudence that touches upon issues of not related to the religion per se, but to the practices and living of individuals, which is fantastic. And I hope that will be contagious to other countries, not only Islamic countries, but at least the faith leaders adopt such institutional mechanisms to make it, institutional in the way people deal with their surroundings and their environment. I'm not sure if we have any of the online speakers. No? Okay, so, well, again, I want to continue. I would love to go to the workshop modality, but allow one or two questions first. Possibly we will have the online speakers. So one or two questions to the panel, if any. Okay, it seems things were beautiful and clear. So, Christian, you have 10 minutes in leading us on how we mobilize global youth movements through education, especially on green faith festivals. And by the way, I don't know if you know, we are working on issuing a Green Faith Festivals guidelines. Actually, also in 2 or 3 days, we will be launching guidelines on plastic pollution for faith communities. It's a wonderful, colorful, example full of success stories. But indeed, we would love to hear from you on the Green Faith Festivals.
Thank you very much again, and thank technical difficulties. One of the things that I find so rewarding about being on the Faith for Earth Youth Council, and as I mentioned before, there are profound ideas already within the. Oh. Okay, is this better? Okay, is that profound ideas are already in the room, and so what I wanted to do with my time today is practice that a bit by asking some questions to you all and also my fellow panelists on what the challenges of mobilizing sustainable living are. I think Dr. Iyad is right to point out that whereas much of the world sees faith as an integral part of their relationship with nature. That is not the case where I work, which is in the United Kingdom, and it's certainly not the case where I'm from, which is the United States. But I think that there is tremendous potential when other political discourses fail. I was talking to Martha earlier today with the election of Donald Trump as president and tremendous evangelical religious support for him. I think that an opening has come where we can engage in discussions about what it means to live sustainably, not from the basis of the scientific foundations for it, as much as important as that is, but rather from the spiritual sense, and to say, how can we engage in these discussions from a different way? But I digress. As chair of the Faith for Earth Youth Council, what we do is we convene over 40 incredible young people based around the world, again, that are already seeking to advance sustainable living in their local communities. And we do this through convening these young leaders through monthly meetings, facilitating networking, and amplifying their efforts in spaces such as this one. So whereas in the first session I spoke a bit more from my role at LSE, I now am transitioning a bit to my role at the UNEP Faith for Earth Youth Council. However, as we mentioned before, this is a very challenging space. Mobilizing the global youth movement, mobilizing the faith movement to live more sustainably, again, particularly where I live and work and I'm from, is quite difficult. So I want to ask the first question being, what is the greatest challenge you are facing in your communities when trying to inspire behavioral change from the perspective of faith towards sustainable living? So I don't know how this is best going to work, but maybe you could shout out the answer and I'll relay it into the microphone. Yeah, please.
So I come. Is that better? Yeah. I come from the grassroots organisation, United Religions Initiative, and we're working globally, but I work particularly on environmental issues. And I was just saying to Iyad, I'm trying to promote the concept of a living environment, and of course that is from advocacy to planting trees. Is a much broader thing. In my experience, it really needs to be, first of all, intergenerational. Secondly, I was giving a talk yesterday about the spiritual aspects, and as far as grassroots people, they're not being listened to when it comes to implementing projects which may cost thousands of dollars. Within 2 years, that money is just completely wasted simply because the local communities are not being